Does anyone know the original meaning or where the word came from? The word hypocrite. Greek. What did it originally mean? What did it refer to? I don't know about that. I think that was a person. Well, no, this one, I know the answer to this one. I think that was Hippocrates. Yeah, that was Hippocrates, unless he was named, I don't know, for being hypocritical. I don't know how that one works. Hypocrite was originally used of actors in Greek theater. That was a name for an actor. And can you see how from that we get the meaning we typically do? It was someone who pretended to be something they weren't. But of course, in the stage setting, everyone knew that. They knew they were taking on that role. They knew they weren't really that character. But the word, even again in Greek culture, and certainly has Jesus used it, as we're going to look at it today, it came to mean that idea of not being real, not being yourself. And typically the usual focus that we hear today, at least when I think of it, is a person's actions don't match their words. And what they say they believe, they're things they actually do, they don't match. You say one thing, you do another. Well, in Matthew chapter 23, where we're at this morning, Jesus is going to use the word hypocrite 6 times of the Pharisees. And at first you might say, well, of course, those Pharisees, just the worst of the worst, hypocrites. But you have to stop and realize, according to that usual idea that your actions don't match your words, well, in a lot of ways, the Pharisees had some really good actions. I mean, Jesus is even going to talk about the fact that they tithe. He said in other places, they pray, they fast. We know they offer sacrifices. They read the scriptures, all these things that we would say, well, those are good things to do. And so maybe being a hypocrite means something a little deeper. Maybe it goes further than we're used to thinking about it. And I believe what it talks about, Jesus' use of hypocrisy, the deeper meaning is it's when our heart doesn't match our words and our actions. And so today, again, as we look at this chapter, and maybe you read ahead and saw we're talking about the Pharisees. If there's any chapter that really doesn't apply, not like the Pharisees at all. But when we look at this deeper idea of what hypocrisy is, as Jesus talks about it, our question today that we're going to ask over and over is, does my heart match my words and my actions? And not just do I do things that follow what I say, is my heart really there with the things I say and I do? So we're in Matthew 23. And as I read, people couldn't agree. Does it really fit with the chapters before? Does it fit with the chapters after? And I say yes. Both. You can tell how it definitely is the culmination of the past couple chapters that we've been looking at. And this idea of, whose expectations am I living by? And not just whose, but how do I know whose expectations? Because it's so possible to think, I've got it. And you look at the people, the crowds waving Jesus in, and certainly the leaders, and they didn't have it. And maybe didn't even know, some of them. And then we saw the idea of this idea, there's no excuse for missing God's purpose. He's made our responsibility clear. He's made our opportunity clear. How is it yet we still miss it? And we've said it's really down deep. We don't want it. We sort of like the idea that we live by, the way we live, the purpose, the expectations. And then last week it led up to that, can I handle the truth? God's truth is clear. It's not so much a matter of, what does God say? What is the truth? No, it's there. Do I really want it? Because a lot of times, again, we say, I've got a version of the truth that's working pretty well for me. I'd just soon keep it. Well, it culminates today as Jesus looks at these people who, it's very clear, they know they're not following God. Their heart's not there. And Jesus is very firm with them. And it's going to lead into, and he's already been talking about this, the result of this is not just going to be a separation eternally from God, but for the Jews specifically, it's going to result in the destruction of their city down the road. And so that's what we're going to see next week. So that's where this chapter fits in between the ones we've looked at and what's coming up. Let's look at Matthew chapter 23, starting at verse 1. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, sit in Moses' seat. Now, right there, we need to ask, what's that mean they sit in Moses' seat? And as I looked, it seemed like the scholars were divided. You had some people who said, well, that is just completely, metaphorical. It means they've taken on the authority of Moses. He's the one who gave the law. They're the ones who now read and teach the law, and they have, the authority of Moses. Others said there was a literal seat in each of the synagogues, and that's where the Pharisees would sit during the services, rise out of that, but that would be their seat. And it had the authority, again, of Moses. And so really, whether there was a literal seat or not, it's this idea that the Pharisees have the authority of Moses. They're the ones who are teaching his law. And Jesus goes on, so you must be careful to do everything they tell you. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. Now, I just made a point of saying they do a lot of things in accord with what they say, but ultimately, what Jesus is saying, that the true heart of the gospel, the heart matter, the heart commitment, they don't have that. Don't do what they do. They tie up heavy cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Now, you look here, and at first it makes sense. Where Jesus says the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, they sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. It makes sense. Okay, don't do what they do. They don't really follow through, not from the heart. Don't follow them. But that first thing he says, you must be careful to do everything they tell you. Like, that doesn't really make sense. I mean, he's going to go on to say in verse 4, they tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders. Now, obviously, that's not literal. They don't weigh someone down and have people that just carry loads for them. Talking about the religious obligations they put on people. Just saying that's what they do. That's what they tell you to do. Well, then why does Jesus say be careful to follow their teaching? Matter of fact, we saw earlier, it's even clear in Matthew 16:6 there on your handout. He says, be careful, Jesus said to them, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And you remember the disciples were all confused. Is he talking about bread? And, Jesus is like, really, guys? I've multiplied bread twice. And they realized then he's talking about the teaching of the Pharisees. So he's already said their teaching is bad. Why does he say then you must be careful to do everything they tell you? I read one commentary, and he said, well, when they're reading strictly from the law, you got to listen to that, but everything they teach about it, then throw that out. And I don't know, that might be it. I think a better explanation, and it comes through a little clearer in the New American Standard, that word sit in Moses' seat can have a slightly different meaning. The New American Standard translates that they have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. And so the idea is not that Jesus is approving of the fact and saying and agreeing, yeah, they have the authority of Moses. He's sort of saying they've assumed that authority. They put themselves in the place of Moses, but when you look at everything he has to say, he certainly doesn't agree that they deserve it. He's going to make it as clear as you can. They're hypocrites. And so it seems like maybe Jesus is being ironic. He's saying, hey, look at these Pharisees. They think they're up there on the level of Moses. You better be careful to do everything they tell you. And he's being ironic. He doesn't mean it. And we might think, well, Jesus, well, he's going to say later, he's going to have a sense of humor. He's going to talk about straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. We've seen other things. I think it totally fits with what he's saying here. And so it sort of eases, like, how's that fit, Jesus? They don't even teach the right things. He's not telling them to follow that. Don't follow anything they say or that they do. Well, what can we get from this? Each of these sections, I want us to ask the question, does my heart match what I say and do? And so here, I think it's the fact that, he says the Pharisees tie up heavy loads for the people to bear. Well, if you were to ask the Pharisees, why do they do that? I think their answer would have been, we do it for God. We want to make sure the people obey God. We want to make sure His holiness is preserved. That's why we do what we do. But from what we know about God, that's certainly not His heart. He didn't give the law to weigh people down, to burden them down. God gave the law to help people as a practical way. Here's how your life would be better. Here's how you need to live. And then also the New Testament adds the element. He also showed that, by making it very clear what you need to do, you realize you can't do it, and it leads to a relationship with Christ. So everything about the law really was to encourage our relationship. Matter of fact, it says, Jesus said in Mark chapter 2, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Here's one of the chief laws of the Jews. God said, matter of fact, when it was instituted that Moses said, don't work on the Sabbath, remember what happened to the guy who worked on the Sabbath? He was put to death. God was very serious about this, but Jesus makes it clear God's seriousness is not because the rules are more important than the relationship. The rules are to help with the relationship. God created us not so he'd have people who follow rules. He created us to have a relationship. The rules assist with that. And as we ask, does my heart match what I say and do? I think the thing that came to my mind is sometimes we look at people who aren't following God's rules, and I think we get more concerned about the fact they're not following God's rules than about the fact they don't have a relationship with God. You know what? God can stick up for himself when it comes to the rules, and God will be the ultimate judge. If someone hasn't followed the rules, God will give what's deserved. But he doesn't want to give what's deserved. He'd rather have a relationship, a graceful relationship where none of us get what we deserve. And are we more concerned about a person and their lack of a relationship, or the fact that maybe they don't follow the rules? Again, the rules are important, but the rules are to assist and help with the relationship. Does my heart match what I say and do? Well, he goes on, and he's still talking about them. Everything the Pharisees do, is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide. Oh, okay. And the tassels on their garment long. What's a phylactery? Well, that was a leather box. And inside were written scriptures. Yeah, and it would be worn on the forehead, or it would be worn on around the wrist. And it came from the Bible, but it seems like they took something literal that God meant metaphorical. God said after the Passover, the Israelites had been, escaped Egypt. He said, I want you to remember the Passover each year at this time, and every firstborn is dedicated to me. You sort of have to purchase back the firstborn, certainly of humans, of firstborn sons. And he says, by doing that, it will be like a sign on your hand and a symbol on your forehead. So it doesn't seem God meant for them to do that, but they did it literally. Okay, but Jesus is saying the problem is you make them wide, so it's not you're doing it for God. You want people to see, hey, look how big my phylactery is. And then it talks about tassels, and God had said in Numbers, you are to have tassels that hang long. It's just a physical way to set you apart from everyone else. But they made their tassels extra long. They want people to know, yeah, here's my tassel. It was all for people to see. They loved the place of honor at the banquets, near the front, near the host, and the most important seats in the synagogue, near the scroll. They loved to be greeted with respect in the marketplace and be called rabbi by others. And so it's this idea of what do they love? And it's not God, it's the attention of people. Everything they do is done for people to see. And which goes back to the fact they do good things. If they're trying to do things to impress others, they're not going to slap people around. They're not going to yell at people. They're doing, quote-unquote, good things. They're doing it for people to see. And so as we ask this question, does my heart match what I say and do? For them, it definitely didn't. But what about us? I think sometimes we have the attitude, well, at least I'm doing it. At least I showed up to church. At least I read my Bible. At least I serve and do this ministry. At least I do it. That's not God's attitude toward that. Because you see the Pharisees, and you see it really ends up worse. At first it might be okay, but when our motivation isn't out of love for God, when it's to try to get attention or anything less, it's ultimately going to end up worse. Both for our relationship with God and certainly our witness to others. Well, Jesus sort of continues that thought. Verse 7 again, they love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and be called rabbi by others. Then he says in verse 8, but you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And you are not to call anyone on earth father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant, for those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, have you ever read that and wondered, like, okay, your kids ever call you father? And you're like, well, uh-oh, am I breaking the, Jesus' command here? What was happening is these all had specific connotations in Jesus' time. Rabbi literally means my exalted one. And so they were teachers, but that title put them inherently. There was something about them that lifted them above everyone else. Father, in this context, again, they would call a father, but this was used of rabbis that had lived in the past and sort of, over the years had become respected more than others. So all these past rabbis, you look back and this one stands out, that would be called a father, an exalted rabbi. And then instructors, the New American Standard has leaders. This is the idea of a personal tutor, someone who more attention was paid to that person than to God. He was more important, the teacher in that sense, than what he was teaching about God. And so that's the issue with all these. That in Jesus' day, they all had specific connotations, and you can tell what that was. It's, verse 11, it's all together. The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled. Those who humble themselves will be exalted. See, every one of these titles was seeking exaltation, was seeking attention of people. We want to let you know we're better than you. So call us this, call us that. So when it comes to using them today, I don't think it really applies if it doesn't have that same connotation. It'd be like other things that are different. Jesus, it says in the Bible, greet each other with a holy kiss. Well, it had a different connotation then than it does now. Even just to talk about titles, I got to thinking, a banker who handles loans probably doesn't want to be called a loan shark because it has bad connotations, But if 50, 60 years from now, a loan shark came to be, a person who aggressively gets you the best loan, then, okay, I'm a loan shark. It's all what the title, what the term means. And so in Jesus' day, all these titles had this, prideful connotation. And Jesus says, don't use those. You don't be called any of those because, again, their functions were good. They were teaching people the law, but their heart wasn't there. They were more interested in the attention of people and being exalted by people. And so I thought again about us. How does this apply? Does my heart match my words and my actions? I don't know that titles is a big thing. I know today probably the closest it comes is, what do we call me? The pastor. I don't typically go by that, especially the pastor. There's nowhere in the Bible where there's one pastor in a church who's above others. A pastor really is a synonym for elder. And we're always a group of elders. So definitely it's gotten misplaced today to say there's one pastor. Now, I do think maybe Lisa should be called the First Lady. Don't know if you've heard that, but there are a lot of churches around where there's the pastor and his wife is the First Lady. So she had someone who used to kid her about that where she works. So no, we won't go with that either. So yeah, when it comes to titles, I don't know how much applies here. What I really thought about is the idea that these people were active in a ministry. They were serving God, but they weren't servant leaders at all. And that definitely comes through. Jesus in the Bible, the New Testament, over and over and over, whenever it talks about leadership, it talks more about the spirit with which you do it than what you do, the specifics of how you do it. We've got to be humble. And so anything that we do, if we're doing it at all for the attention of people, we're missing the boat. If we're not willing to be servants, Jesus, the greatest leader who's ever lived, not only did he go to the cross and that ultimate sacrifice, but you remember before that, he washed people's feet. I mean, that's our model. If we're serving God in any way and we don't have that mindset, then again, our actions may be great, but our heart's wrong. All right, he goes on and now he begins this series of woes. Verse 13. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. Before we look at that verse, you'll probably notice in your Bible, verse 14, it has a parenthesis around it, or maybe it's not even there. It seems like the oldest manuscripts, verse 14, wasn't there. It was added later. It's really a little bit like a verse in Mark and Luke. Once again, I don't ever let that undermine your confidence in the Bible. We know where these spots are. None of them are anything major if it was there or not. But Jesus talking about this, I think really this is like the central point of this passage. He's been leading up to it, and now everything else is going to explain it and amplify it. But this is Jesus' main issue with the Pharisees. You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. They're the ones who are supposed to be leading people to the kingdom of heaven. And not only are they not doing that, they're having the very opposite effect. He says, you don't let those enter who are trying to. And then in the middle, he says something that for me was sort of like the wait a minute. He said, you yourselves do not enter the kingdom. And I thought, wait, that's what the Jews were all about, was the kingdom. They were waiting for the Messiah. They were waiting for the kingdom. They were focused on it. And he says, you yourselves don't enter. And I think the reason what he's saying is because their idea of the kingdom didn't match God's idea of the kingdom. They were all about it. They wanted the kingdom, but they wanted their version of the kingdom. And Jesus came bringing something that they realized very, very early on. This is nowhere near what we're thinking. We don't want it. We don't want your version, Jesus. Well, what is the kingdom of heaven? What is it that they're missing out on and we need to make sure we get? Well, it actually, people talk, is it the church? Is it heaven? What? Well, really need to know more what constitutes the kingdom of heaven. And the opening of the model prayer really tells us, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. And then the next verse, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's Hebrew parallelism. Your kingdom come is parallel to your will be done. The kingdom, just think about a king. What constitutes a king's kingdom? Well, it's the realm where his will is done, where he is the authority, where people recognize his authority. The same thing for Jesus. Jesus' kingdom is the realm of people who recognize his authority. Right now it is the church. It's believers today. Eventually it will be heaven. The church in the heaven, the kingdom is already present in the church, but it's not yet fully present until we get to heaven. But what marks both of them is, again, that surrender to God, and it's what the Pharisees didn't have. And that's why he says, you shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. Now, they couldn't, if someone truly wanted to enter the kingdom and serve God, they couldn't keep them out. But he's saying, by the nature of your leadership, as the religious leaders, the way you go about leading people to God has the exact opposite effect. It keeps people out of heaven. And he goes on to talk about that. He says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You travel over land and sea to win a single convert. And when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. We don't know exactly what the mission program was of the Jews. It doesn't seem it was very involved, but he's saying at times there was. They would go out to try to make a convert, and whatever they did, his point is really the end. You sharing your version of the kingdom with them makes them twice as lost as they were before. And before they didn't know God and they were lost. Now they know this terrible, distorted version of him. They're as much a son of hell as you are, twice as much. And notice what he says about them. You're separated from God. You haven't entered the kingdom. That's the same as having that relationship with God. Well, once again, we ask this question, does my heart match my words and my actions? And I think this section is what shows us why it's so important. If our heart doesn't match what we say and do, it totally undermines our ministry and our witness. It undermines the spread of the kingdom. Your kingdom come, well, your kingdom can't come. It can't spread. Why? Because I'm doing something that totally undermines my ability to spread it. And maybe even others, because they look at me and they say, if that's a follower of God, if that's a disciple of the kingdom, I don't want it. And so we keep people from having that relationship with God. This is why it's so important. Then he goes on to talk about some of the specific ways. He says, woe to you blind guides, which, just think of that there. Not only are you blind and you can't find your way, you're the one who's supposed to be guiding others. You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gift on the altar is bound by that oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it. And anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and the one who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it. Well, the first thing that might come to mind is, didn't Jesus say we weren't supposed to swear? That verse there in Matthew 5, he said, I tell you, do not swear an oath at all. All you need to say is simply yes or no. People were basically, if I just say yes or no, I don't have to follow through. But if I swear, that's important. And Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, no. Here, he's not in favor of swearing and making oaths. But what he's saying is the way you Pharisees go about it is just another example of your hypocrisy, of your abuse of God. What's the reason for their distinctions, you think? It says, if you swear by the temple, that's no big deal. But the gold of the temple, that one you got to follow through on. You swear by the altar, you can, ignore that. But the gift on the altar. I looked at that, and to me, it's just keeping in line with what we've seen. This focus they have on the physical, which becomes a focus on me. And you might think, well, the temple's physical and the altar's physical. Yeah, but, from the Pharisees' point of view as the religious leaders, and their power is measured by not just the fact they have that temple, but the gold they bring in and all the sacrifices that keep, the system alive and support things. They become more focused on that. The temple's sort of a given, but how much gold do we have? That's important. How many people are sacrificing it, keeping the system going? That's important. And again, we've said, if our focus switches to the physical, it's going to switch to me versus God. And that's the contrast Jesus makes. When he says there, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it. It's the altar that's important. Anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and the one who dwells in it. What's more important than that? And then he even adds, anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and the one who sits on it. I think he's trying to just remind these people, and certainly remind the readers, because the Pharisees probably won't get it, most of them. Like, do you realize when you swear by heaven, you're swearing by the creator of the universe? The God who created us, who sustains us. That's what you're doing. Put that in perspective, he's saying to them. Well, again, as we ask the question, does my heart match my words and my actions? I don't know that swearing oaths is really an issue for most of us. I swear on this. Probably not much. But, as I thought about this, I think it really applies maybe more than some of the others today. Is our focus more on God or things associated with God? Again, the altar and the temple were very closely, those were God's specific things to do. And they put more focus on the things associated with God, the gold, the sacrifices. And I thought about us today. Do we put more focus on God or on the things associated with him? And maybe for us it's easy in this room because, we're not in a church building. We don't have the sacred windows and the communion table that you can't move. I remember being on the school traveling team. Yeah, we had this group. They were singers. I ran sound and preach. But that was the first question you would ask in every church. Can we move the communion table? And it was not assumed that you could move the communion table. There were some churches absolutely not. So we'd have to work around this communion table thing. Why? Because that's the table. That's where the communion is. You don't move that. Do we put more focus on God or the things associated with God? And today, some of the great buildings, and let me tell you, I can remember, and maybe if you've been around long enough, you've heard me say, we get to the point, at Scottsdale that we needed a new building. I wanted there to be a fountain. Church building, that'd be so cool to have a fountain. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with excellence in a church building, with beauty in a church building. Some of the greatest architecture in the world was done by Christians in the form of church buildings. But the thing was, those were expressions of their worship to God. They didn't overshadow their worship to God. And I think it can happen anytime, but certainly today, the things associated with God can overshadow God himself. And so we need to ask, does my heart match what I say and do? Well, then he continues, verse 23, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. Well, the first thing you see here is you give a tenth. That's the tithe that we hear about. If you ever talk about giving a tithe, if you're giving a tenth of your income, that's a tithe. If you're giving less, it's not a tithe. If you're giving more, it's a tithe and an offering. Tithe means 10%, a tenth. In the Old Testament, they were commanded to give a tithe. Matter of fact, they were commanded to give 2 tithes every year and 1 every 3rd year. In the Old Testament, remember, there wasn't the separation between their religious institution and their civil government. It was all sort of racked up together. So that was their offering to God and their taxes. In the New Testament, we're never commanded to give a tithe. I used to preach from this passage, and I'd say we're commended to give a tithe. He says, it's good that you do it. But even then, he's talking to people under the old law. And there is no commandment in the New Testament to give a tithe. Now, we are told to give, and we're told to give generously, cheerfully, all those things. And I think, my opinion, I think a tithe still sets a good standard for that. For most people. And the only way I think it changes is if you get so much money that a tithe isn't either sacrificial or an act of faith. I think that's what our giving needs to be. There needs to be an element of sacrifice that I'm doing without. Doesn't mean I do without everything and live in a cardboard box, but I don't also buy every single thing I can just because I can. There's some element of sacrifice, and there's definitely an element of faith that we give our offering to God first before I know what's going to be left at the end of the time. And that's how our faith really grows. Again, for the majority of people who don't have so much, that again, to give a tenth at the beginning, Bill Gates could give a tenth and he's got really no concerns if he's going to make it through the week. Most of us aren't in that situation. So I think a tithe is still a great standard for that. And if anything, it would only go above that if we would be even more blessed. Jesus talks about this tenth, and it's interesting. Notice what they do. It says they give a tenth of their mint, their dill, and their cumin. He's talking about these little spices. They get 10 of those leaves. They make sure that one of those little leaves goes to God. They are meticulous about their tithing. Wow. But look what he says. You ignore the more important matters of the law, which right there is interesting. I know some preachers who wouldn't like to say there's anything more important than, the giving. He says there are things more important, and the reason is because these other things deal with the heart. You can give your money and not have a heart committed to God. But to practice justice and mercy and faithfulness, those are going to result in actions, and you know what? Faithfulness may even result in tithing. But those are heart conditions. Those are heart characteristics. He says that's what's important. That's where your focus needs to be. And so, again, as we ask this question, does my heart match what I say and do? Does my heart match? I'm doing good things. Okay, the Pharisees were doing good things. What about me? He says this, you blind guides, you strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. Obviously, he's being a little facetious there. But he's talking about, they would drink. They'd have the pitcher out. And maybe we've been there, while the weather's good, you're outside and something falls in your, you sort of strain out that little bug, strain out that little leaf. He's saying you're careful to get that thing out, but you swallow a camel. You focus on these little meticulous details, but you miss the bigger things. And what about us? Maybe we do some good things, but I thought especially, what do people see? Maybe we take our Bible to work and it's there on our desk and they even see us read it. Maybe they know I listen to Caleb, they know I go to church, but then do they see me get angry at people and be impatient with people and not be generous? Again, those little things that aren't wrong in themselves and even aren't little in some way, they don't count if our heart's not there, those heart characteristics. Verse 25, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside will also be clean. Jesus moves back and forth here between, metaphor and then making direct statements. You clean the outside of the cup and dish. They had definite rules about cleanliness and what you needed to do. But inside, he says, then they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Obviously, the cups aren't full of greed and self-indulgence, so he's becoming metaphorical there. He's saying you, the Pharisees, are full of those things, even though you're real careful to clean your cups well. You don't clean the inside, and that's really what he's making the point. What's inside you is so bad, what's on the outside doesn't matter. And so he says, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside will also be clean. Now, that's not a method for doing dishes. I want my older daughter to say, hey, I cleaned the inside. Jesus said that's all I need to do. The outside dirty, it just happens automatically. No, again, it's this whole point. If you start the inside of you, your heart, what's on the outside will follow. And that's where he goes in next on verse 27. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Now, these whitewashed tombs, it wasn't the whitewash that made them beautiful. I don't know if any of us would say, smearing on some whitewash makes anything beautiful. The tombs were beautiful already. They were decorated in different ways. The whitewash was something they would do during these festivals. When people from all over the world literally would come, like Passover, they would put whitewash on the tombs because if a person accidentally touched a tomb, they would be unclean. And so they'd travel all this way for the festival. They wouldn't be able to celebrate it. And so the locals would whitewash the tombs. And so it's the idea that the tombs are beautiful on the outside, but the whitewash adds to the fact of being noticed. And so it shows what Jesus has been saying with the Pharisees. You do all these great things on the outside, and you make sure people notice them. But inside, just like those tombs are full of something unclean, inside he says you're full of hypocrisy and wickedness. You look great on the outside, and you make sure people see the outside. But the inside's what's important. And so again, does my heart match my words and my actions? This one, it really made me think, what do I think more about? Do I think more about my spiritual growth, or do I think more about what people see from me? My appearance. And you see the difference there? Am I more concerned about truly growing, maturing spiritually? Or am I more concerned about what people see? And here's the problem. If I'm more concerned about what people see, it's going to keep me from growing because I won't be honest. I won't be honest with you to have that support I need from other people. I won't be honest in a group to be open to the grace of God. I won't be honest with myself. Am I more concerned about what people see? Well, don't let them know that about me. Or am I more concerned about growing? God, I want to put it out there because I want it to change. I want to grow. Well, 29, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in the shedding of the blood of the prophets. And so they're looking back. They realize and understand that during the Old Testament, there were times that the people of Israel not only just didn't listen to the prophets, rejected them, they tortured them. They killed them. They were that much against them. And he's saying that you modern generation, you say, oh, we'd never do that. We weren't anything like them. He says, so you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Not by building the tombs, but by the actions he's been talking about. You show you're their descendants. And again, in that culture, remember, a descendant is someone who shared the same characteristics. You show you're just like them. Go ahead then, Jesus said, and complete what your ancestors started. In other words, this wickedness, fill it up. And I looked at this, and again, do my words match my heart, or does my heart match my words and my actions? And I thought about us, and we look back, just like these Pharisees looked at their ancestors and said, oh, we're nothing like them. I think sometimes we look at the Pharisees and say, oh, I'm nothing like them. I'm not perfect, I know that, but I'm nothing like those Pharisees. Well, really? And here's my thought. The quicker you say no, the more you need to stop and think about it. Am I anything like the Pharisees? After we left the group Tuesday night, we had talked some about being open. And Lisa and I, we were talking with Charlie, and we said, we look at you, our kids, and we can see some things that they don't see. We look back on our lives as kids, and we can see some things now we didn't see then. But it struck us, are there things that now about us that we don't see? And we asked her, do you see things we don't see? We need to ask you, our friends, do you see things we don't see? All the time. And not just the thing I'm looking for around the house that everybody sees I can't find. Yeah, we're talking the spiritual things. Don't think, again, to say, oh, I'm nothing like those Pharisees. The quicker you say that, the more you need to really stop and think, am I? They were doing all these great things. If they were looking at that, they'd say, oh, we're doing wonderful. But their heart was off. And then Jesus, more directly, he's called them hypocrites. He switches around toward the end here as he closes. You snakes, he says, you brood of vipers. How will you escape being condemned to hell? Again, not for their lack of good actions. Jesus didn't say, you scored a 50 and you needed 51. It's their lack of commitment. Therefore, I'm sending you prophets and sages and teachers. And that word, if you're wondering, because back up in verse 8, he said, don't let anyone, call you rabbi, for I'm your only teacher. The word really is scribe there. So Jesus didn't use the same word twice, once saying don't be called it, and here saying I'm sending teachers. He's sending scribes, people who would teach the law, but it's a different word. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue them from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, who was murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I tell you, all this will come on this generation. He's saying, that the people of God, you've had a history of persecuting, of killing godly, righteous people, starting with Abel, and we know that one, Cain and Abel, all the way back to the beginning. He says then ending with this Zechariah, son of Berechiah, and we're not sure who exactly that was. There's a Zechariah who was put to death for being a prophet, but he wasn't the son of Berechiah. There's a Zechariah, son of Berechiah, but he wasn't put to death for being a prophet. The best alternative seems to be it was someone that's not mentioned in the Bible. It's someone closer to Jesus' day, and so he's making this point from the beginning of time up until right now. Constantly, you have been putting to death God's people who were righteous. And it seems that's someone that we don't know about specifically. And so again, what do we get from this? And I thought about it, does my heart match what I say and do? What's the ministry of these people Jesus is talking about? Prophets and sages and teachers or scribes and these other people, their ministry was to proclaim the word of God. The prophets would receive it, the teachers would teach it, but the people rejected it. And so I thought about us. How open am I to the word of God? And at first we may say, well, of course, I study my Bible, I do this. But again, these people studied their Bible. These people were totally in the word, but they missed it. And so I think the question that came to my mind is sometimes it's the people, a brand new Christian, someone who's not grown up in the church and becomes a Christian, they are so open, like, teach me, I am ready to learn. But sometimes we get to the point as Christians that we've learned some things and put some things together, and it's hard to change our mind. We read everything not with like an open mind of what's this say, but how's this fit into what I already think, maybe consciously, maybe unconsciously. And we need to be careful about that. And I'm quick to share the negative examples. I'll share one on the other side. I've grown up in church my whole life, literally from my first Sunday. I've been in Sunday school and church. I have a bachelor's in Bible and a master's in theology. I know the Bible pretty well. But I read it as much as I can. I read it with an open mind. What's this say? Does it contradict something I've always thought? In fact, I'm looking ahead for next week in the destruction of Jerusalem in the end times, and I read something, and it changed my view on that. And that one really isn't that big because I was always wondering. That one's been disputed ever since it was written. What's the best place? And I really like this view that I read, and I think it fits it best. But what's really hard sometimes are the things, again, just the foundational, the assumed things. As we read the Bible, does it challenge what I think? Do I allow it to? Do I examine what I think? And then the last verses here, Jesus says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And we're not sure what that last phrase means, you won't see me again. It seems like maybe he's talking about the only people who are going to see me are those who open their hearts to me and say, blessed is he, realize Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and they'll see him. I looked at this and I thought, despite everything, he's just made this totally clear, irrefutable case about how wicked and hypocritical the Jewish leaders are and all those who follow that system. But yet, what's he say at the end? He said, there's a punishment coming on you. But I wish it wasn't the case. I still want to have a relationship. I long to gather you in, but what's the problem? What kept it from happening? He says, you weren't willing. And again, I think of these people who wanted a relationship with God, but they wanted their relationship with God. Jesus is offering the relationship, and they say, no, we don't want yours. We don't want your version. And so they miss out. And the same thing, does my heart match my words and my actions? Jesus came offering an intimate relationship, but it's focused on our heart. Have we been saying, Jesus, here's a relationship that I'm up for. Here's what I'm offering, and is it different than what he offers? As you bring all these together, and this is how I hope we're learning to read the Scriptures, you read the parts, you get what they mean, and then you bring a main point to bear. And the main point today, as I look at all this stuff and how just forceful and direct and, eternal Jesus has made some of his pronouncements, I think the main point here is hypocrisy is absolutely unacceptable to God. And you look at that and you might think, well, gee, you got murder and adultery, and it's not like God's in favor of any of those, but look how he talks about hypocrisy. Why is that one so different, so much worse? And I think before we ask why, we have to make sure we're clear on what. What is hypocrisy? And especially because I don't know if you've ever been there, but sometimes non-Christians will look at us, and none of us are perfect, and they might accuse us of being a hypocrite. I thought you were a Christian, you hypocrite. Being imperfect is not the same as being a hypocrite. Because we're all imperfect. The Bible makes that clear. Everyone, all of Jesus' disciples, his followers, they were imperfect. He didn't call them hypocrites. The difference between a hypocrite is that's someone who willfully refuses to make that full commitment. Again, they are saying things, maybe they're even doing things as a show of commitment to God, but the commitment isn't there. Not a true commitment. Again, sometimes it's the one, oh, I'll commit in this area, but not this. Well, that's really no commitment. You're saying, I will maintain control. I'll give you the pieces I'm comfortable with, God. Commitment to God is, even our commitment isn't perfect, but it has to be total. It has to be full. That's what commitment is. Well, why is it so important? Well, think about it. Our entire relationship with God is based on this commitment. That's what constitutes the relationship. You know, we're so glad that God doesn't look at our level of goodness and badness and say, no, this relationship's over, you're below 50%, you're below 8, whatever. No, we're so glad he doesn't do that, but he does look at our commitment. Have you made a genuine, complete commitment to me? And you think about it, it's absolutely necessary in light of what we've been talking about of worshiping God. To say that, God, you are the creator of the universe. You're the sustainer. You keep everything going. You sent your son to redeem us. How can we truly believe that and not fully commit to him? It just absolutely makes no sense. You're the creator, and I'll give you partial control, which means I'll really keep control and I'll give over the parts that I'm happy with. It makes no sense to say that. Commitment is absolutely required. It's why some people read through the book of Acts. Have you ever wondered? Remember the story of Ananias and Sapphira? The church at the time, people were selling some of their property and things like that, and they were giving the money to the church. And it said, Barnabas did it, and the people recognized it. He didn't do it for the applause, but, people look, hey, wow, that's Barnabas. He's a great guy. Well, Ananias and Sapphira, it says they sold some things, and they came and they gave the money to Peter. And Ananias said, Peter, this is all of the money we got for this property. And Peter, the Spirit spoke to him, and he knew it wasn't all the money. And God struck Ananias dead. Sapphira came in later and same thing. Peter said, this is how much you sold it for? All the money? She says, yeah, we're giving all the money. And God struck her dead. You ever wonder why they got struck dead? For lying, basically? For stealing maybe? For lying? It does say they lied to God. Is that what put it over the edge? I think the real key there is they were being hypocritical. They were saying, God, we're all in for you in this. And they weren't. And especially as you read through the book of Acts, that's in Acts chapter 5. It comes right after 4, and you see the hypocrisy of these Jewish leaders. And this is the first instance, and I think it was some people, whether knowingly or unknowingly, we're going to test and see if we can get away with hypocrisy in the church. The Jewish leaders, look at what the way they've been living for so long. Can we do that? Can Christians get away with that? Say one thing, do some things that match, but not really be committed? And God gave a strong, resounding no. That is absolutely unacceptable. Again, because hypocrisy undermines our very relationship with God, and by doing that, it undermines our witness. If we're hypocrites, how are we ever going to spread the news of the kingdom? If we're not fully committed, we won't be able to have a positive witness on people, certainly not to help them become fully committed. And so we look at this, and to me it brings up the root problem. I think the root problem today, the reason that we can even have this danger and the reasons that the Pharisees did of being hypocritical is that we focus on the external physical actions. And we judge our relationship to God. Do I have a good relationship to God? Am I committed? Well, yes, I do this, this, and this, and I don't do this, this, and this. And you know what? It's possible to do this, this, and this, and not do this, this, and this, and still not be truly committed. I thought of football games. I'm thinking of football games and waiting for them to start. But I thought of football games. And every once in a while, usually the stats will match up to the score. The team with the most yards, the team with the most time of possession probably has the highest score and they win the game. But you know what? If a team had the most yards and a team had the most time of possession, no one looks at that and says, did they win the game? They look at the score. And I think sometimes we look at the wrong thing. We measure our Christian life based on the yardage or the time of possession, and the thing that matters is the score. And the score in this case is our commitment to God. It's not how many good things I do. It's not how many bad things I don't do. It's not how much I've grown in terms of doing better and not doing bad. And it's all about our commitment. Jesus said, if you want to be my disciple, he didn't say, do a lot of good things and less bad things. He says, lay down your life, take up your cross daily, and follow me. Be committed. That's the essence of our relationship with God. And I think many of us, again, I use this analogy of signing our name to a sheet. We've added things to the sheet. God, I will do this and this. I won't do this and this. And we sign our names, but we haven't signed our name to a blank sheet. God, whatever you say. And how do we overcome that? Well, the key to overcoming, I think, is first of all, realize the difference. I think a lot of Christians don't know. If you would ask them, how is your relationship with God? The first thing they would rattle off is, great, I do this, this, and this. I don't do this anymore. I used to do it all the time, and now I don't. My relationship with God, yep. And we don't even know the difference. We need to know it, and then we need to begin emphasizing it in our own lives. This is where the focus is. It's on my heart. Not that the things I do or don't do aren't important, but those come out of my heart. I need to know what they are. I need to know what the target is, what to shoot for. Don't do this, do this. But I need to know how to do it. And the how goes back to this thing we've been seeing over and over. It's this worship. How do I have this commitment? Well, I worship God. I focus on the worth of God. And specifically, I think I focus on his love. I focus on the love of God. That's what it tells us in 2 Corinthians 5. It says in verse 14, for Christ's love compels us, because we're convinced that one died for all and therefore all died. Again, we believe it. And he died for our all, and those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again. See, he's talking about our actions. We should live no longer for myself, but for him. It should change my actions. But what changes my actions? The love of Christ compels me. Because I believe that the Son of God died for me, it changes the way I live. But it starts with the love of Christ. And not just the fact he loves us, because you know what? Christ loves everyone. And there's a lot of people who aren't compelled at all to live for him. And so the other verse that we need to factor in with this is Ephesians, where Paul prays, I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, that's how you became a Christian as you heard about the love of God, may have power together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how wide and how long and how high and how deep is the love of Christ. Do you begin to see what he's saying there? How just vast this love is. And to know this love, and this is a verse that I love, know this love that surpasses knowledge. I want you to know something that you'll never completely fully know. That you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. What's that last phrase mean? Filled to the measure of the fullness of God? I want you to live a godly life. I want you to do godly things. I want you to not do ungodly things. To be filled to all the measure of the fullness of God. How does it happen? By knowing God's love. We do things because of Christ's love, but we have to know it. And he says here, don't ever think you can check it off. Oh, I know the love of God. Check it off, move on. Because this love of God surpasses knowledge. You'll never fully know it. Never stop worshiping God, declaring his worth, specifically in this case, realizing he's worthy because he loves us so much. And that will change the way you live. That's how those things that we say and do will happen. And that's what a true life for God will be if it's committed to him. Well, what do I need to do now as we close this up? And I'm going to use this formula one more time because it fits. First of all, I need to ask myself, does my heart match what I say and do? Not what do I say and what do I do even. Does my heart match what I say and do? Do I just do godly things, or am I truly committed to God? And I think a lot of people wouldn't know the difference, and it starts with us knowing the difference. It's a different thing to do all these godly things. Am I truly committed to him? Is my sheet blank or just agreeable? God, I've agreed to these things. I'll quit doing them. God, I've agreed to do these things. I'll sign my name to that. God says, I want a blank sheet so I can put whatever there I want. And as I tell it to you, you're on board before I even tell you. And then the last thing that we've been saying every week, ask God to help me get it. Ask God, Lord, as I read your word, help me to see things that I haven't seen before. Help me to be open to it and not think I know this already. Lord, as I'm in situations, help me to look and examine them and see what lesson you want me to learn. God, as we talk with each other, help us to spur each other to see your truth, to live your truth. God, help me to get it. And what will it look like when we do that? Take a negative example. Verse 37, Jesus said, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. I read that and I thought, what if we were willing? Can you imagine Jesus being a baby chick under the wings of Jesus? That characterizes your life. Everything I face it knowing I'm a baby chick. Jesus has me under his wings. That's my situation. That's the reality here that I can't see in the midst of whatever situation I do see. Can you imagine fully living your life that way? That's what God wants. And it happens when we commit to him. Well, as always, and as lately, start to live it out, and I don't have anything down there. What are your thoughts? This really does tie in with the last few weeks. Next week is going to be decidedly different as we look at the prediction about the destruction of Jerusalem and Jesus' second coming. This week concludes what we've been seeing. How do I live this out? How do I begin to live this full, true commitment?